My name is Sudeep, and I'd like to invite you to the first session on day two of our RWE Search Conference. Today, we're starting this session with a fascinating discussion on a topic which is more of a eminence-focused topic, trying to understand what the latest trends in real-world data are. And we have two outstanding presenters today, both from Deloitte. Incidentally, for those who don't know this, Deloitte was one of the pioneers in this space. The whole focus within the Deloitte consulting practice on RWE started years ago with an initiative called ConvergeHEALTH, which is, I think, one of the first times where we've sort of started getting access to a lot of the patient data that forms the very foundation of what we do in RWE. And presenting the thoughts today are two of my former Deloitte colleagues, Jeff Morgan and Raveen Sharma. Both of them are eminent. They work extensively in this space, and I'm really hoping that this will be a fascinating conversation. As they're presenting, keep your questions coming. I'm sure they'll try and spend a little bit of time towards the end to answer those. Right. So with that, Raveen and Jeff, all yours.
Great, thanks a lot, and thank you everyone for taking the time to speak with us. You can go to the next slide. Can we pull up our slides? There we go. So as you said, we're going to spend some time talking about industry trends in real-world evidence, and over the last several years, Deloitte has been tracking these trends through a benchmarking survey that we conduct about every 2 years. Our next one's going to be coming out next year. But essentially, this survey is focused on, helping the industry understand some of the key trends around real-world evidence as it relates to what capabilities organizations are building to maximize the use of real-world evidence, what use cases are companies focusing on, and what's the level of strategic importance and investment in this space. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the findings from this study, and also some of our observations we've seen from working with many of the peers, many of the leading organizations in the pharmaceutical industry in this space. So we'll touch on three what I'll call macro trends that we're seeing, and a lot of this information bubbled up out of our survey. The first one really is around advanced use cases. Now, real-world evidence isn't new necessarily. It's been around for 20 plus years. Is referred to as observational research or outcomes research 20 years ago. So what is new about real-world evidence, though, is the use cases. So historically, it's been used for traditional HEOR type use cases to support access and reimbursement during the peri-launch phase of a product. What we're seeing now are companies starting to find opportunities to leverage real-world data and evidence across the entire product lifecycle, all the way from clinical development through commercialization. So seeing a lot of emerging use cases around informing clinical trial designs and even augmenting clinical trials by using real-world evidence as synthetic control arms. And then we're also seeing companies get a little more aggressive with using it more proactively in the commercial space. So using it to generate a more differentiated narrative around their products when speaking to physicians and payers alike. The second trend, and Raveen will talk more to this one, is really around the technology investments that we're seeing across the industry. So, going back 20 years ago, there was a handful of data sets that were accessible to organizations. Now data is becoming more ubiquitous, and the variety of data is becoming more diverse. So this is putting strains on legacy technology systems, and we've seen over the last probably 7 years companies really invest in building out modernized platforms to better manage these data, and to essentially the goal is to generate evidence at scale and do it in an efficient way. The last trend we'll talk on is really around a paradigm shift that we're seeing just in the evidence generation process. Just with the sheer number of studies that are being generated from an organization right now, it's becoming overwhelming, right? Some companies are doing hundreds of studies in a given year to support their products. So they really need to get more sophisticated in how they manage this portfolio of evidence. One, to make sure that it aligns with the overall product goals, and make sure that it's, supporting all the value messages that they're intended to support, to ensure both, technical and regulatory success as well as commercial success. So let me double click on the first key trend here. So just setting some context. So from our last survey, this one was in 2022, we asked a lot of questions around, what's your vision for real world evidence? And the vast majority, 88% of organizations that participate in the survey, had a vision to have an end-to-end capability that supports R&D through commercialization and market access. So the entire life cycle of a product. 82% of organizations that were in our survey actually already had mature capabilities built to support these use cases, or were in progress of developing them. From a technology perspective, we've seen companies probably over the last 5 to 7 years put significant investment into building out those modern platforms. And the vast majority of those organizations are now reporting that those investments are actually starting to pay off. They're creating efficiencies in the generation of RWE, and also improving how, the management, access, and governance around the data as well. Another key trend that we see across the industry is the shift to internalize more of this work that was historically outsourced to vendors in the past. So we see about 58% of the companies that were in our study said they're conducting at least half their real world evidence studies internally, and a little under 20% are conducting the majority of them. And I think, they're doing this for two key reasons, really. First one really is to drive efficiencies in evidence generation. Can we do it more efficiently, quickly, at a lower cost? And then the second one, which I think is probably more important, is to build up the institutional knowledge of their own teams. So as companies outsource this type of work, that knowledge gets built up outside their organization. So companies are trying to really build up their own internal knowledge around these disease states and methods and therapeutic areas, so that they could, benefit the most from that information. And then the last key trend is around integrated evidence planning. So 53% of companies in our survey are starting to take an integrated approach to evidence planning. And what I mean by that is bringing together a cross-functional group of stakeholders to talk about the needs of all the various healthcare stakeholders, regulators, patients, providers, et cetera, talk about all their evidence needs, and then make trade-offs and have a collaborative discussion around, what evidence is the highest priorities, which ones best align with the value proposition of our product, and let's make trade-offs and prioritize the evidence that we think is going to be most impactful to ensure both technical and commercial success of the asset. So from our survey, we asked, we asked participants, what are some of the top applications of real-world evidence across your organization? And so just to orient you to the slide, the lighter blue on the right side is what they responded to in 2022. The next 2 to 3 years is what they envisioned would happen over the next 2 to 3 years. So as you can see, the use cases that are really around supporting value and access were top priorities. So looking at things like understanding economic burden, mapping the patient journey, these are all, pretty traditional studies that are done to support the, access and reimbursement of products. As well as, monitoring patient safety and signal detection. Again, that's kind of a traditional use case that we've seen for many, many years with real world evidence or observational research. What is interesting, though, is the shift that participants anticipated, which is really a bigger shift to the R&D space around supporting things like regulatory submissions and label expansion. So there's been, over the years, there's been, a significant amount of examples out there in the public where real world evidence was used to support, either a new label expansion and many regulatory submissions. Something like, I don't have the stats in front of me, but of the last maybe 100 or so things that went to the FDA for approval, something like 80% of those had RWE as part of the submission package in some form, whether it's to provide additional clinical context as part of the submission, or it was used actually as evidence or a control arm in the trial. So we're seeing this big shift towards these R&D use cases, not only during the submission process, but also to inform key decisions as drugs are getting developed. So being able to better understand subpopulations and heterogeneity of treatment effects, being able to inform protocol designs, being able to augment those clinical trials with synthetic control arms. So this is an area where we see it applied, like in rare diseases and oncology are two areas where we see this quite often for various reasons. But it's, it accomplishes a couple of things, right? It accelerates the time to the trial, because in rare disease trials, it can be very time consuming to enroll a control arm, or it could even be unethical in some scenarios to enroll a control arm. So we're seeing, good adoption of synthetic control arms in select disease areas and select therapeutic cases. We also asked the participants in the study, were you guys realizing value from real world data today in R&D? So this was kind of interesting. So starting at the bottom of the chart, the biggest area where, and this is going back to 2022 when these results were gathered, is really around informing those internal decisions. So enabling a data-driven understanding of progression of disease for populations of interest. So these are all analyses that companies are doing to inform key decisions as they're developing products, and they're using real-world data to do that now. Another big area where we see value getting realized today is as the focus and importance on diversifying clinical trials continues to grow. Companies are starting to turn to real-world data and evidence to help with that. Being able to use this data to identify investigators and pockets of patients who better represent the diverse populations that are suffering from a given disease. So these are just some of the areas where companies are seeing value today. And I, in my opinion, we're going to continue to see more and more investment and more success in this space, because it's, when you think of an ROI on RWE, this is probably the place where it's the easiest to quantify it, right? We were able to shorten a trial, right? We were able to enroll patients more closely to what our projections were. We had less amendments for our trial. So all these KPIs are a lot easier to measure than some of the other ones for some of the other use cases. So you're able to really quantify the impact of RWE and R&D much easier. And then the payoff as well is significant, right? So shortening a trial, is not is a significant cost savings, right? Getting a drug to market on time is additional revenue captured. So all those KPIs are obviously very important to organizations, and they're very measurable. So I think now I'm going to turn it over to Raveen to talk about our second trend.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. So dovetailing on, those are the ambitions. Those are where players in the pharmaceutical industry are anticipating going. That comes with having to apply effort, time, resources, and brain power to achieve. What's helpful sometimes is to just kind of take a step back and look at what we're dealing with. So really, it's pretty amazing when you look at what constitutes patient data that is pretty readily available, right? Through external sources, internal to the organization, internal to the pharma company sources. And really you come away with, patient data is very big, it's complex, and it grows at a rapid pace. So what we've tried to just kind of lay out on this picture is all the sources, the most common sources of where patient data is sourced from or coming from, right? So obviously there's a tremendous amount of value in the clinical trial data that has been executed and stored over time within those companies. There's the kind of emergence of data that goes beyond your clinical, your claims and your electronic medical records. So the new modalities or emerging modalities, some are not so new, such as omics, but the notion that data source or that data modality is available, through sources like UK Biobank and a slew of others. So bringing that into the mix. As Jeff mentioned, there's been a lot of interest and a lot of focus on diversity in trials and making sure that the population that you're attempting to target is represented in your clinical study. So, the social determinants of health, all the other kind of aspects around a patient that may not necessarily be measurements of an endpoint or some vital sign, but play an important role in that patient's progression and their relationship with that disease. So all this data keeps growing. The sources of those data become more readily available over time through various data providers. You have a tremendous amount of data internally that needs to be harnessed appropriately. And you've got new emerging technologies or technologies that have emerged that allow you to link the data together as well. So that gives you a lot of power in terms of what use cases you can address. So looking at the use cases, and there's just a few representative ones there. So when you start thinking about, if I can understand the relationship of that patient to their disease, to the state of that disease within their cohorts, you can start unlocking some pretty powerful use cases. So takeaway here is patient data is big, complex, rapidly growing. And really, it starts becoming a challenge for researchers to be able to synthesize this data, source this data, be able to apply their questions to derive insights from this complex data. So next slide, please, Jeff. So this is a statement of kind of what does the landscape currently look like? And, this leads into the investments that the organizations, the pharma organizations in the industry are starting to make in terms of modernizing their capabilities, right? So we covered the first one pretty well. Data is more complex than ever. Secondly, there's a lack of modern underlying data infrastructure. So, things are pretty well characterized and managed when it comes to claims and EHR data that you purchase. But then all the new modalities of data, I'll pick on UK Biobank in particular, because we've received a tremendous amount of requests from our clients to help them there. What the challenge there is that volume of data is significantly bigger than what they've dealt with before. And also the tools to look at and analyze genetic data and mutations and SNPs is something that's a little bit more unique in terms of from a real world perspective. So there's challenges there. What this leads to is there's a prevalence of point solutions. So what we see when we come in to assist our clients, what we see is, sure, there's data coming in, there's internal data. It may or may not be connected or brought into the same place, but that's okay. But then what ends up happening is every group that has a need will start developing their own solution to that specific data. So it's a point solution. It's tied to that specific data model. There's no kind of ability to link to other concepts or other data sets. So that kind of keeps going and going and going. And those investments eventually, after 2 years, they die and fizzle out. So yes, it was an investment made to address that particular question at that particular point in time, but it doesn't persist. And that's where, we see a lot of, we see techniques to enable that. Thank you for all your questions. What we'll do is we'll reserve some time at the end to address those. So thank you, sir. And then inadequate data and solution governance. So what also happens a lot, it's still not solved in a consistent way, across the industry is gaining access to a data set. So, there's the appropriate provisions and controls to the data. And thank you. And sorry, all these comments are making me lose my train of thought. So really the aspect is, can I gain access to a data set? And then there needs to be an automated way to say, okay, for this data set, the organization has this many licenses. And yes, you are within a group that has the expertise to analyze that data. So there are systems now being put into place that check for your credentials, check for your training badges that you've achieved to be able to handle that kind of data and automatically provision that data access for you. So the kind of takeaway from this slide is really that more modernized data management practices can alleviate a lot of the pain. Not all of it, but a lot of the pain. Next slide, please, Jeff. And so the concept that is being put into practice is really this concept of data products, right? And so it's moving away from the kind of, this is a spectrum of maturity, if you will. So going from point solutions to this notion of data products, right? So data product is essentially, it's owned by the business, and the business guarantees that the data is of a certain level of quality that serves a need that can solve for certain use cases within the business that the business has. So there's a level of governance and ownership that is a partnership between IT and the business. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to provision that data with multiple use cases in mind. So you don't build these point solutions. So one is you're essentially enabling a one-to-many benefit. Secondly is these solutions, these data products, they can be at different kind of levels of enrichment, if you will. So the most basic is enabling, say, a data source such as a claims data or a EHR data set. And what you've done is you've ingested it into your environment, into your four walls, per se, in your cloud environment. You've gone through the metadata checks and the data quality checks, and now you're saying this is certified, ready for use. So anybody with the right access privileges can pick it up, right? The enriched data products that we see a lot of our clients starting to work on, and some have achieved tremendous success, is taking those data sources and using linking techniques that are tokenization effectively, combining it with some of their internal data and focusing in on a specific disease area or indication, and then serving that up. So you can imagine, to the organization, here is a comprehensive real world data set with some linkage to internal data, either clinical trial or patient engagement data, and saying, for multiple myeloma, here is the data for the organization to use. So you can start to see the evolution of that value. Next slide, please. I won't go into tremendous detail here, given the time constraint we have, but this is what the future looks like. This is focused in on some of the new modalities that our clients are grappling with currently. And you can see, genomics, kind of the more research-focused assays, digital pathology, and images. So the idea is you have consistent frameworks to pull that data into an environment where you can then harvest the metadata. That metadata goes into a searchable place, a searchable catalog or a searchable application, so you can search and find that information. And then it goes through multiple tiers of processing. So raw storage, so you can always trace back to the original results. So if you're tracing back the lineage of your analysis, you can do that. Tier 2 is more normalized and linked. And Tier 3, maybe the combination of the clinical data with the high dimensional data, such as a genomics assay or a digital pathology image. And that essentially becomes the corpus of data which can drive your AI and ML use cases. So this is the direction where leading organizations are going in terms of technology investments. With that, I think I'll turn it over to you, Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Raveen. Okay, so I know we have a few minutes left, so I'll try to be brief in this section. But the third trend really is around this paradigm shift in the evidence generation process that we're seeing. So for those who aren't familiar, when I say IEP, I'm referring to integrated evidence planning, and there's been really an evolution of this process. It's essentially a shift from isolated, siloed efforts to more cohesive, patient-centric approach to have cross-functional collaboration to optimize your evidence plan to ensure both technical and commercial success for your assets. So it's moving. If you go back, 20 years ago, evidence generation was very siloed. Over time, it's become more and more integrated loosely. Over the last couple of years, there's been a more standardized process, a more standardized IEP process put around this to drive that cross-functional collaboration and make those trade-offs. And I know I talked about this earlier on, but about 53% of the participants in our survey in 2002 were already actively using integrated evidence planning, including RWE. So they're, some of the key observations we've seen is, organizations really need to consider a broad set of external stakeholders. So not just the regulators, not just the payers, get all stakeholders that you need to serve with this evidence represented in these cross-functional groups. So you could have that discussion and that do the prioritization, as a whole, and look at your evidence as a portfolio. You really need to provide a structured approach to analyzing these trade-offs and choices as well. So you just drive some consistency in how they're done. This will help really drive that cross-functional alignment and accountability around the organization. And again, the effort, one of the main goals really here is, one, to develop evidence that is most impactful for the relevant stakeholders. And then two, try to do this in the most efficient way, right? There's limited resources, whether that's money, whether that's people and time. So what's the best use of our limited resources? Which activities should we put those against to get the most return on our evidence? And as this has become, especially in the large biopharmaceutical companies, this is becoming more and more common to have an integrated evidence planning approach. One of the main downsides to it is it's very time consuming and manual, right? It's bringing together a lot of stakeholders from across the organization into these collaborative workshops. There's a lot of input coming from many different stakeholders. So what are companies doing to help improve this aspect of it? So they're starting to digitize the integrated evidence planning process. So they're developing solutions and systems that really provide a transparent, systematic approach to evidence planning. It documents and provides traceability to all the decisions that are made. It provides a central location where these plans can be managed and monitored. And it allows you to do real-time tracking of your portfolio of evidence generation activities. So as priorities may shift, you could shift your evidence generation activities accordingly. And one of the nice benefits of these digital solutions is you're capturing a tremendous amount of data on how these plans were generated that can be used to inform future plans. So with AI kind of being incorporated to almost every aspect of drug development, here's another place where we see tremendous value in being able to mine a lot of this information to inform future evidence plans. So just some final thoughts. So Raveen and I get asked from time to time from some of our clients, what are some of the leading companies doing in this space? Like, what are some of the key takeaways? So I'll go through this quickly. So it's setting an enterprise strategy if you don't have one in place already, and just making sure you're revisiting that strategy to ensure that it's, one, effective, and two, still meeting the needs of the organization. Companies will need to continue to invest in these capabilities as the demand for evidence continues to grow. Scaling this capability is going to be required, and technology is going to play a big component of that. There's also going to be significant investment in data sources. More and more data sources are becoming readily available, every single day, and they're very valuable. So having appropriate funds to get access to those is going to be important. Looking for ways to integrate real-world evidence into relevant processes, such as clinical operations or commercial analytics. So embedding it in these processes, I think, is key to changing the ways in which people work with it. Governance is also a key aspect to it. So having an enterprise governance that allows appropriate access to the data for the right purpose by the right users, but you don't want to you don't want to put friction into the system. So you want it to be as effortless as possible, so you're not slowing down any of the necessary orthodoxies and experiment and get hands-on experience and learn with this. The space is moving very quickly, so that setting aside time to experiment and innovate is going to be key to staying at the forefront of innovation. So with that, I know we're a little bit over, but I'll turn it back over to you.
No, thank you so much, Jeff and Raveen. I mean, look, I think it's a fascinating set of information and data, and I was really tempted to ask a couple of questions and also pull you into a couple of questions, but I'm also getting like a lot of things from the organizing team saying that, look, we're running over. So look, I wish we had a bit more time, but thank you so much for taking time and sharing some of these thoughts with us. We look forward to continuing this conversation offline going forward.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for being
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.